Good evening, everyone. My name is Dimitris Poulios. I'm an architect and urban planner from Space, and I'm also a lecturer in the Technical University of Crete. And today we are going to discuss about how, in the process of in the whole process of integrated urban development and that we are discussing throughout this course, the participatory approach is integrated and joined in this process. Give me 1 minute to minimize some things here. Okay, great. So, in this sense, the first question that we need to answer is what we call by participatory planning. What is the term, how it's being used throughout the decades, and how we use it today. We thought that the best thing that we need to start with is by doing a small introduction describing the history of the term, and this will move us to more recent practices in the last years. So, participatory planning or participatory design or the whole concept of engaging with the community in the design of an urban plan or a public space or even a policy is a movement and a methodology that emphasizes the importance of involvement of local communities in the decision-making process. And it started, in a sense, as a movement. Now it's more or less a very common practice. The origins of this participatory term in planning can be tracked back to the 60s and the 70s, and is linked with a wider critique on post-war development and the modernist planning process. It was a movement that affected, and this is also important, widely both urban planning, architecture, urban design, and in general, the way that we approach and the way that we work with communities in every project that is related to space. So, as I said, we can track the origins of the participatory movement in the 60s, in the long 60s, as we can describe it, and it's actually a movement that is related with radical politics and of the era. I need to remind you that we are in the mid of the 20th century. We have a very interesting period that is linked with the whole discussion about post-war redevelopment. So we have a very strong critique in the modernist urban planning movement that was predominant in this period, employed top-down approaches in the urban planning process and technocratic approaches. And it was criticized in various aspects that we're going to see them in detail. So participatory planning emerged in this sense as a response to this criticism, offering alternative that prioritizes community engagement, social justice, and inclusivity. These were the main terms that were very important in this era. We need to remind that we are in the 60s. We're in an area where we had a very huge debate about social rights, particularly in US, but also in Europe. In Europe, we had a very strong critique on urban war reconstruction with many scholars, academics, and practitioners criticizing the whole process of post-war redevelopment. So what were the main, let's say, elements of this critique? The first one was, first of all, a top-down versus a bottom-up approach. So we have a process that, in a sense, is characterized by a very strong and very hierarchical state intervention in most cases, or municipal interventions. We have very limited participation of local communities, very limited participation of even of experts that could help in the process of redevelopment. The whole critique also focused a lot on social equity and social justice. We had several cases, particularly in the US, where this whole movement was joined with the civil rights movement and even feminist movements in this area, in this period. We have also the long discussion about community participation that started in this period, more or less. The diversity in context of sensitivity of how do you implement a project in an area without affecting local communities. All this had to do, of course, with power dynamics and the essence of collaboration in planning process, which is very important. And it was a critique based on the response to community needs and an aim towards holistic and inclusive planning that starting emerging in the late 60s. In the next few slides, I want to highlight a few things about some, let's say, major representatives of this movement, experts, community leaders, and architects or planners that helped, in a sense, frame the discussion about participatory planning and participatory design overall. So the first one is Paul Davidoff. Paul Davidoff was one of the pioneers of participatory movement. He emphasized the importance of involving local communities in the planning and decision-making process from start. He was an activist. He advocated for what he called advocacy planning, which sought to empower marginalized communities and ensure their voices were heard in planning process. In a sense, the concept of advocacy, it's very interesting. So Davidoff was the first one that said that we need, that the experts need to be advocates of the local communities. They need to participate with them, communicate with them in order to have a successful implementation of a project. It represents a departure from the traditional top-down planning methods that were very common in this period, and emphasize the active participation of communities in all the process of planning and design from the initial stages to the stages of implementation. The next thing that we need to do, I wanted to focus on, is also comes from US. It's the work of Norman Krumholtz on equity planning. So all these terms, advocacy planning, equity planning, we're going to see next more terms that are common. They have the common attribute. They have this common vision of participation. They're very similar in a sense, but they were focused in different aspects and were introduced in a variety of contexts. So in a sense, Davidoff, Krumholtz, and all the other experts and academics that we're going to see in the next slides worked closely, didn't work together, but they worked in the same period, and they all together start to frame this movement that we're talking about. So Krumholtz is very interesting personality. What is interesting is that he comes from public service. He worked in the planning department of Cleveland in the 70s. And Krumholtz, Cleveland, for you that don't know, it's a very interesting case with a very high proportion of Afro-American communities. Actually, Cleveland was the first, if I'm correct, municipality to elect a mayor coming from this community. So as you can understand, it's a city, the case that had to do a lot with the civil rights movement and all the contradictions and struggles around it. So in the 70s, the city tried to revise the urban plan. Krumholtz was at that time the director of the planning department, responsible in a great extent for this revision. And what he did that was also a very pioneering issue in that period, is that tried to depart the notion of planning, which in the America of the 70s, it was very much focused on zoning, land use, and a lot on infrastructure, to urban and social issue, and more on social issues. So this where the notion of equity comes from. I mean, the essence of that the city needs to be a place of that the community lives together, that is equitable, as the term signifies, and that the zoning and the planning process needs to reflect also these issues. So we have the Cleveland Policy Planning Report, published in 1975, that highlights all these issues. And it's the first document that focuses, it's the first institutional, in a sense, document that introduces community engagement in the planning process in a major city in the US and in the Western world overall. As we also note in the slide, Kramholz is the one that said that planners may choose to stay within the narrow boundaries of their customary area of expertise, or they may define new roles from themselves. So this, in a sense, what Kramholz introduced to the planning practice, that planners, as I said, focused a lot on very technical issues, are also responsible through their designs, through their work, for the daily lives of many communities. So we need to address issues that are social and urban related. So, and I think that this is something that we need also to take into consideration today. Following also, and it's also very interesting that, in a sense, participatory planning as a discipline, more or less, comes from, there's a lot of work from the US where we have a tradition of, in a way, communities, we have a very strong role of the local communities and neighborhood associations and local movements, and all this is important. It's very different from Cyprus or Greece, and even Europe in a sense. And I think that this is something that we need also to take into consideration. So the next thing that we need to highlight is the work of John Friedman, that published again in the 60s. The work of his is focused on what he called transactive planning. Friedman published a book that was called Retracking America, a Theory of Transactive Planning, that tried to connect the participatory movements of the 60s in a variety of ways. The book, in a sense, reflects its time, so it captures the influence of social and political movements and how this could affect the planning process in America. So, in a sense, he says that planning needs to be active, needs to be transactive, taking into consideration a variety of elements from social issues, economic issues, issues of migrant communities, of disadvantaged communities, and so on. Sorry. So we move from the planner's perspective to a more architectural-based perspective. 60s and the 70s were, and the 80s in a sense, a period of very vibrant discussion among architects of how the discipline evolves. And this required a lot and focused a lot on issues of community engagement and participation of the users of space in the design process. So we have the work of Jonah Friedman on mobile architecture. His work challenged, in a sense, traditional notions of architecture, and so to create a more flexible and adaptive structure that could respond to the dynamic needs of the communities. I want you to, all the things that we're going to discuss in the sense of architecture has to do a lot of this kind of adaptability and flexibility of the structure of the construction. So all the discussion in a sense of the participatory movement and the community engagement movement in architecture that also have a connection also, has a connection with urban planning process and urban design, is the need that that architects and planners do not need to create a final form. They need to create the baseline that community is going to create its own forms, its own dimension. So he created this vision of ville spéciale or special city. This concept envisioned, in a sense, a three-dimensional framework that could be inhabited by residents who could attach their own living spaces to the structure. The idea was to create a flexible and open framework that could evolve over time, and citizens are going to adapt their needs and transform this framework. Keep this image in your minds because we're going to see it replicate in the last decades a lot. Again, the work of Jona Friedman is linked with that of Lucien Kroll. Lucien Kroll, again, created this concept of open architecture, he called it. There are very many similarities with mobile architecture, as you can see from the previous slide. Kroll's philosophy emphasized a lot on collaboration with the occupants of the building, fostering a sense of community and incorporating the user's needs and preferences into the design process from scratch. So Lucien Kroll, in a sense, worked a lot with the communities for which he designed. So we have several examples that we're going to see later, but just keep in mind that all these concepts, in a sense, are linked under the notion of adaptability, flexibility, and so on. Similarly, the work of Christopher Alexander on pattern language, those that are more have a background in urban design. Christopher Alexander is a very important, let's say, personality. He was an academic, a practitioner. He created this concept of organic development based on the understanding that the mechanisms of city and evolution in history are linked. And there's a need for bottom-up approaches and participation that all this lead to a flexible development. Again, the issue of flexibility emerges over time and then again and again. We see it as a mobile architecture, we see it as an open architecture, we see it here in the concept of pattern, but all these are in a sense linked. And we will see all this in some cases that we think that are very important in this concept. So the first one is a project in Lima, 1968, in Peru, in the area of Pamplona, where there were the very significant issues of housing local population with many informal settlements and people needed sheltering. UN funded what was called the Experimental Housing Project, or PREVI. This was a very pioneering program at the time where a variety of architects were invited from and urban designers from Aldo Van Eyck, Christopher Alexander, that we saw his work, James Stirlings, and many others that worked with the local communities in order to create housing projects with different types in order to accustom different needs. So this is the result of this process. In reality, it was the creation of a baseline framework that residents could adapt, evolve, and change. It has a lot of similarities, and this is very common in all these participatory projects, that you create a baseline where the user can put his or her own ideas, needs, and involve the housing unit, the planning unit, etc. So we have this idea of a row of houses that the users could adapt them, put more units, put more rooms in order to facilitate their needs. The next project is one of Lucien Kroll. It is the La Meme, the Maison Médicale of the Université Catholique de Leuven in the UCL, as it's called, not the one in London, but one in Leuven. So Kroll created a master plan for the area that combined both the student residencies and the whole medical department. So he worked a lot with the user space, where were the teachers, the lecturers, and particularly the students. So the result was this kind of building that, if you see in abstraction represent, it's very common with maybe apartment buildings in Greece or in any other southern European cities. So it's very uncommon for Northern Europe, but it's actually a result of this process of participation. So users added all these elements and functions in the building's facade in order to facilitate their needs. So we had a lot of new additions, a lot of balconies, as you can see. So all this structure was kind of a process of redeveloping a building with the users as from scratch. So the next project is the biker wall in the UK. It's in one sense a milestone project for the whole discussion on participatory planning and participatory urban development. It's a work of the British planner Ralph Erskine. So Biker Wall, the whole area of Biker was low-class tenement housing project in UK. You can see how the area was before the demolition. So it's, in a sense, a row of houses, very bad conditions for the people that were living in it, but it had some kind of community. So what Erskine tried to do was involve the people. One moment. Okay. In the whole process. So the area was demolished and it was redesigned from scratch. But instead of replicating and creating this kind of typical low housing development, it tried to include all the families in the process of design. So he created an office in the area, and what he did was trying to discuss the plan with every user of the space. And the result is what you see. It's a very interesting project where it mixes different kind of typologies from large scale, let's say, building blocks to more detached and semi-detached houses. The users have the ability to change the facades and again personalize the whole development. You can see how it looks today, and it's again very interesting because that we see similarities with the previous one with La Meme. We see how balconies were attached in the areas that the users wanted. We see that some users preferred lower houses to resemble the areas that they once left. And so this is a kind of project that it's very successful how to construct to introduce variety in the design and create a place where users feel very attached to it. Of course, there were many problems. As you can imagine, participatory process is not a process that it's very time consuming. So people had to relocate and brought back to the project in order to live again in it. This meant that many of them could not achieve that. So people that left found accommodation elsewhere. So those that came, and few in reality were those that from the old people of Barker and residents that try to, in this 10-year experience, return to the project, to the area. And this is a very common problem to all the participatory planning process, that time is the main constraint. And people, in many cases, don't afford to wait in order for a process to be finished on time and return to a place that they once lived. The next project is one of Christopher Alexander. It's again a project in the US, in Oregon. It's a problem. It's an experiment and a project that had to do with the University of Oregon. So Alexander, with his team, was commissioned to redesign the whole campus of the University of Oregon. And he wanted to implement this concept of pattern language that we presented earlier on. So what this meant that Alexander created a framework where the users would adapt and change, and a framework that gave the opportunity for stakeholders of the university to adapt the design based on the needs of the university. So we have several steps, as you can see in this diagram, where the area is densified according to the needs of the users. So as you can imagine, we have a first stage where a part of the development is being facilitated. We have an extension and then another extension. So all this step-by-step development creates this kind of pattern that Christopher Alexander refers to. Again, this diagram that present this idea, and this I think is the most interesting one, that shows this kind of densification. And in a sense, this is something that we see in all the projects, that we don't, all the participatory methodologies do not create actually an end product. So this is the final design, and people need to move to that design, or cities, but they create this kind of framework that can be evolved. People can change it, or authorities can change it based on the needs of the user. So again, we see this in urban planning master plan, where we can see in this figure ground how this is going to be involved in the following year. So it's a kind of phasing if we see it in contemporary terms, but something that was not very common 40 years ago. From this project, from this single project, we move now to a more, let's say, universal project, in a sense that it represents a whole country. Portugal, after the democratic transition in the 70s, initiated a project that was called SAL in 1974 and 1976. So SAL, in a sense, was a project that targeted it was a housing project that aim to house over 50,000 Portuguese families in many cities across the country. So it was a very interesting case because, first of all, it was implemented, particularly in the first year, in the first phase of development. It was linked a lot with the social movements of the time. There was a very strong housing movement in Portugal that emerged after the fall of the dictatorship in the 70s. And the project also involved many participatory techniques, from assemblies, co-design process, even involvement, as we can see in these pictures, of locals in the construction of the projects. It's evident that many architects that worked in these projects, in these housing projects during the 70s, are very well-known architects in Portugal today. And it was one of the first holistic attempts to introduce participatory processes countrywide, and with a great success, in a sense that the developments were made, they were constructed, and people lived there. The end product, again, is similar. And this is very interesting that we can see that. So the final form is adapted by the users. We see a lot of extensions, a lot of similarities in this image, particularly with the previous one that we saw on Biker. Let me just, you can see this kind of work with courtyards. So all this kind of notion of design that we saw it in the previous case. So until now, we were describing some historic cases, in a sense, that focused a lot on the 60s, on the 70s. So at the time, I think we're okay now. Now we're going to discuss a bit about the more contemporary period, in the last decade, 15 years, that we have a new kind of participatory term. So how the previous participatory term ended. So in a sense, until all these projects that we discussed in the 70s and 80s, in the 90s, where we had a turn towards more market-oriented design. As you can imagine, this affected the whole discussion of community engagement. The projects that were emerged in the 90s and 2000s did not have the same principles, did not have the same vision of the ones that we discussed before. And what was also important is that, in a sense, participatory processes were already introduced and institutionalized in several cases. But this also created the problem. So when a notion is created in the institution, is being part of a more of a governance project, in many times it loses its meaning, is not being implemented correctly, and this created many problems. So during 2010, so we have a new round of participatory term, as you can imagine, after 2008, and particularly during the economic crisis and the political crisis of 2008, 2010, and 2012. So we have a period where what was considered as common practice is being rejected. We have a period. It's a period where many traditional urban development trajectories of the 2000s are being rethought and reflected upon. So we have a new round, let's say, of discussion on how the community could be involved in the design process. and what are the new methodologies that we can apply. So in 2016, we have the Biennale of Architecture of Venice is being appointed to this guy, who is Alejandro Aravena. Aravena is a Chilean architect who worked a lot with housing projects and trying to involve local communities. This is his most famous project. Again, this is a project in 2004. Remember all these images that we saw earlier and how similar they are. So it's the Kintamoroi housing project. It's in a sense, it's a project that the architect and the planner create a basic framework, and then the users change it and adapt to it in order based on their needs. So you can see how these voids are being filled based on the needs of the users and the residents. We have a very huge discussion, particularly in the last years, around housing needs and housing problems. The housing problem is something that we are affected a lot here in Greece, but during the tourism boom of the last decade, and particularly the tourism boom in the urban centers, the use of the notion of over-tourism, we have a huge discussion of lack of housing for local residents and how this could be addressed. This is the project La Borda from Barcelona. It's a cooperative housing project, and we can see again how participation is introduced. This is a design workshop with residents of the projects and how this reflects the final design of the project. So we see now a more contemporary approach, of course. Again, we have this is the retrofit of it's the work of Lacatol Vassal in France, a building and that is a former, in a sense, social housing project that's being retrofit into new design based again on participatory disciplines and processes. We see that we have a new kind of view of participation, but the core idea remains the same, that users, that we have a common framework that is adapted based on the users. Again, in terms of mobility, the whole process of participation is reflected in the Superillas project in Barcelona. This is the Superblock project for those that don't know the term, and how this new notion of tactical urbanism, the use of cheap materials, easy to implement, is implemented in this case. The notion of tactical urbanism is an interesting one because it's a notion that has to do with planning, urban design, and a huge focus on public space. So it's not a lot of a discussion about buildings that we saw in the previous projects. And it's an idea that you can create places, and thus comes this notion of placemaking without grand designs, without very expensive gestures. With simple materials and structures, you can have basic forms that people can use and can change the perception of the city and the design. So these are some initial thoughts. I hope that you found it interesting and we're ready for discussion. Thank you.